The grey November sky hung low over London, like a shroud of iron-coloured silk, pressing down upon the soot-stained rooftops and narrow streets, with a weight that seemed almost tangible, almost cruel in its insistence upon melancholy. In the townhouse on Belgrave Square, a respectable address that concealed, as so many respectable addresses did, a multitude of private sorrows. Lady Catherine Hartwell stood before the window of what had once been her mother's morning room, watching the skeletal branches of the plane trees shiver in the bitter wind. She was 24 years old, though she felt decades older, aged not by years but by the particular erosion that comes from loss compounded by dependence, from grief sharpened by uncertainty. 2 years had passed since the carriage accident that claimed both her parents on a rain-slicked road in Hampshire. 2 years since her world had contracted from the warm expansiveness of Hartwell Park to these cold, cramped rooms in her Uncle Edmund's household, where she existed in a strange twilight state, neither guest nor family, neither mistress nor servant, but something suspended between all definitions, a lady of noble birth living in circumstances that grew more reduced with each passing month. The black mourning gowns had been put away after the prescribed period, replaced by dresses of dove grey and lavender that Catherine had altered herself when the seams began to fray, and her needlework by candlelight, a small rebellion against the visibility of her decline. Uncle Edmund managed her inheritance, or so he claimed, the substantial dowry her father had established for her future, now held in trust under her guardian's authority until such time as she should marry a prospect that filled her with a dread as cold and penetrating as the November wind, and that rattled the window glass. Managed was the word her uncle used, always with that particular smile that never reached his eyes, that expression of benevolent concern that Catherine had learned to distrust as thoroughly as she distrusted the ledgers she was never permitted to see, the documents that arrived and disappeared into his study like secrets swallowed by shadows. She pressed her palm against the window, feeling the chill of the glass seep into her skin, watching her breath fog the pane with a ghost of warmth that faded almost as quickly as it appeared. Beyond the window, London prepared for the season, that annual ritual of matrimonial commerce where fortunes and futures were bartered in ballrooms, where young women were paraded like merchandise before prospective buyers who calculated their value in pounds and property. Catherine had avoided the marriage mart for 2 years, pleading mourning, then ill health, then nothing at all because no explanation was required when no invitations arrived, when her uncle made it quietly known that his niece was too grief-stricken, too delicate, too something to be brought into society. But she knew the truth that nested in her chest like a stone, cold and heavy and undeniable. Her uncle was keeping her isolated for reasons of his own, and the inheritance that should have secured her independence was slipping away like water through fingers, like hope through the cracks of her increasingly desperate heart. The discovery came 3 days later, on an afternoon when Uncle Edmund had departed for his club, that establishment where gentlemen retreated to conduct the business they preferred to keep from feminine scrutiny, and Catherine, driven by a desperation that had been building like pressure behind a dam, slipped into his study with hands that trembled despite her resolve. She told herself she merely sought understanding, some glimpse into the state of her inheritance, some rational explanation for the increasing shabbiness of her circumstances and the tension that tightened her uncle's mouth whenever the topic of her future arose. But the ledgers she found in the third drawer of his desk, unlocked, carelessly, arrogantly unlocked, as though he never imagined she would dare look, told a story more devastating than any she had prepared herself to read. The numbers swam before her eyes, columns of figures that documented a systematic plundering, her dowry of £15,000 reduced over 2 years to less than 3, the withdrawals marked with euphemistic notations that could not disguise their true purpose, debts of honour, gaming losses, investments that existed only in her uncle's imagination and the pockets of those to whom he owed money. Catherine's hands steadied as the shock gave way to a cold, clarifying fury, the kind of anger that burns away all peripheral emotion and leaves only crystalline understanding. And she was still standing there, ledger open before her, when the study door opened and Uncle Edmund entered, stopping short when he saw her, his face cycling through surprise, calculation, and finally settling into an expression of condescending dismissal. "Catherine, you overstep yourself," he said, moving to take the ledger from her hands, but she stepped back, holding it against her chest like evidence, like proof of a crime that she had suspected, but never confirmed until this moment. "You've stolen from me," she said, her voice low but steady, each word measured and deliberate. £15,000 entrusted to your guardianship, and you've gambled it away, spent it on your debts, your lifestyle, I have managed your inheritance as I saw fit," he interrupted, his tone hardening, the veneer of avuncular concern cracking to reveal something colder beneath. "And I would remind you that you are in no position to question my decisions, niece, as you remain under my authority until such time as you marry, and on that subject I have excellent news." The way he said excellent made Catherine's blood chill, and she watched as he moved to his desk, extracted a document, held it up as though it were a gift rather than a sentence. "Lord Pemberton has agreed to take you as his wife," Uncle Edmund continued, and Catherine felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her feet, because she knew Lord Pemberton, knew him as a man of 73 years, with 2 dead wives already buried, and a reputation for parsimony that bordered on cruelty, a man who wanted a nurse and a broodmare, and cared nothing for the woman who would serve both functions. "I will not," Catherine whispered, but her uncle's smile was a blade, sharp and merciless. "You will, or you will find yourself without protection, without name, without anything at all," he said softly. "I can make you vanish into poverty so complete that your parents' noble blood will mean nothing, or you can marry Lord Pemberton, secure your position, and cease these tiresome questions about money that no longer concerns you." Catherine stood there, the ledger still clutched in her hands, understanding with absolute clarity that she was trapped, caged by law and custom and her own lack of options. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, some core of steel within her, inherited perhaps from her mother, or forged in these 2 years of quiet suffering, refused to bend, and she lifted her chin, met her uncle's eyes, and said with a dignity that surprised them both, "I will find another way." The invitation to the Weatherby residence arrived 3 days after Catherine's confrontation with her uncle, delivered by a footman who looked apologetic as he handed her the cream-colored card, as though he understood that invitations to modest evening gatherings were poor consolation for the cage in which she found herself trapped. But Catherine accepted it with something approaching desperate gratitude, because it was an escape, however brief, from the suffocating atmosphere of her uncle's house and the spectre of Lord Pemberton that haunted her waking hours. The Weatherbys were distant connections on her mother's side, genteel but not grand, their gatherings intimate affairs of 20 or 30 guests rather than the glittering crushes of the truly fashionable, and it was precisely this modesty that made Catherine's attendance possible. Uncle Edmund dismissing it with a wave of his hand as hardly worth preventing, when her remaining time as a free woman was so limited. She wore her best dress, a grey silk that had been her mother's, and which she had altered to fit her slighter frame, and as she entered the Weatherby drawing-room with its comfortable, if unfashionable, furnishings, and its guests who spoke of books and politics rather than merely gossip and fashion, she felt something in her chest loosen slightly, some small measure of the suffocation easing. It was near the refreshment table, as she stood alone examining the modest spread of refreshments and trying to make herself inconspicuous, that she felt the weight of observation and turned to find a man watching her with an intensity that should have been improper but was somehow merely assessing, his eyes the color of slate in winter, his bearing one of unmistakable authority, even in stillness. She recognized him instantly, though they had never been introduced. Sebastian Thornfield, Duke of Ashbourne, a man whose reputation preceded him like a cold wind, known throughout society as brilliant, wealthy, and utterly selective in his associations, a man who had refused a dozen advantageous matches and kept himself remote from the marriage-minded machinations of the ton with a consistency that bordered on legendary. "You are Lady Catherine Hartwell," he said, approaching her with a directness that bypassed all customary preliminaries, his voice low and measured, and when she confirmed her identity with a small nod, he continued, "I have been observing you for the past quarter hour, and you have not engaged in a single conversation about weather, fashion, or the quality of anyone's complexion, which makes you either remarkably disciplined or genuinely uninterested in the usual currency of social discourse." Catherine felt a spark of something she had not experienced in months, not hope, precisely, but a kind of recognition, as though here was someone who might understand the exhaustion of performing normalcy when one's world was collapsing. "I find," she said carefully, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that surprised her, "that there are more substantial matters worthy of attention than the cut of someone's gown or the probability of rain. Though I confess such opinions make me poor company in most drawing rooms." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but a softening, and he said, "On the contrary, Lady Catherine, such opinions make you the only company in this room I have any interest in keeping." And thus began a conversation that ranged from Gothic literature to the philosophical implications of industrial progress, from the ethics of land management to the poetry of Wordsworth, a conversation in which Catherine felt her mind unfurl like something that had been compressed too long, and she noticed, with a clarity that was almost painful, the way the Duke listened, truly listened, as though her thoughts held value beyond their utility in flattering his own opinions. And when the evening ended and he bowed over her hand with a formality that nonetheless conveyed something more, something she could not quite name, Catherine returned to her uncle's house with the dangerous, fragile beginning of hope taking root in the barren ground of her despair. The Duke of Ashbourne arrived at Uncle Edmund's townhouse on a grey morning when the fog hung so thick in the London streets that the clip of horses' hoofs sounded muffled and distant, and Catherine, standing at her chamber window, watched his carriage approach with a confusion of emotions she could not quite untangle, because she had thought their conversation at the Wetherby residence a singular moment, beautiful and anomalous, not the beginning of something that might extend into her desperate present. She was summoned to the drawing-room 20 minutes later to find her uncle in a state of barely suppressed agitation, his collar slightly askew and his eyes holding a calculation that made her stomach tighten with apprehension, while Sebastian stood by the mantelpiece with that same quality of absolute composure she had observed before, as though he existed in a realm where the ordinary anxieties of mortals could not touch him. "His Grace has made a most unexpected proposal," Uncle Edmund said, the words emerging with a strange mixture of suspicion and eagerness, like a man presented with a gift he cannot quite believe is not poisoned. "He has asked for your hand in marriage, Catherine, with terms that are—" and here he paused, his expression suggesting he found the terms both incomprehensible and fortuitous. "Most unusual." Sebastian's eyes met hers across the room, grey and steady and revealing nothing, and he said with a formality that nonetheless seemed to carry some deeper message, "I have informed your uncle that I require no dowry, no settlement, no financial arrangement whatsoever, Lady Catherine, as my interest in this union is not pecuniary in nature." And Catherine felt the words land like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of implication she could not yet fully comprehend. Her uncle's laugh was brittle, disbelieving. "Your Grace, surely some arrangement." But Sebastian interrupted with a quiet authority that brooked no argument. "No arrangement, Mr. Hartwell, beyond Lady Catherine's consent, which I would prefer to seek in private, if you would grant us a moment." The dismissal was clear despite its courteous phrasing, and Uncle Edmund, caught between offence at being dismissed in his own home and relief at the prospect of being freed from both Catherine and his obligation to Lord Pemberton, withdrew with poor Grace, leaving them alone in the shabby drawing-room where the furniture showed its wear and the curtains hung slightly crooked. Catherine found her voice, though it emerged less steady than she wished. "Why?" she asked. Because it was the only question that mattered, the only question that could possibly encompass the bewildering impossible offer he had just made. "Why would you? I have nothing, no fortune, no connections that could benefit a man of your standing. And we have spoken once, a single conversation, and now you appear proposing marriage with no expectation of, 'I want you, not your money,'" Sebastian said, cutting through her tumbling words with a clarity that was almost brutal in its directness, and something in his expression shifted, a crack in that perfect composure, revealing something intense and carefully controlled beneath. "I have heard the rumors of your situation, Lady Catherine, the whispers about your uncle's gambling and Lord Pemberton's expectations, and I am offering you an alternative, a marriage of partnership rather than transaction, because in our conversation 3 nights ago, I saw a woman of intelligence and dignity who deserves something better than being sold to settle another man's debts." Catherine stared at him, her mind racing through possibilities and implications, searching for the trap or the hidden cost, because nothing in her experience suggested that men, particularly powerful men, offered salvation without expecting something in return, but his eyes held steady on hers with something that looked almost like understanding, and she felt hope and suspicion war within her chest as she asked, voice barely above a whisper, "What do you expect from me, Your Grace?" and watched something complicated cross his features before he answered, "Only what you choose freely to give, Lady Catherine. Only that." Sebastian called upon her the following afternoon, arriving with a propriety that felt almost absurd given the extraordinary nature of their arrangement, and Catherine received him in the small morning room where the light was grey and uncertain, her uncle having conveniently absented himself after making clear his expectation that she would accept the Duke's offer because the alternative, Lord Pemberton, or complete destitution, remained unspoken but understood. She had spent the night in a tumult of thought, examining Sebastian's proposal from every angle, like a gem that might reveal itself as glass under proper scrutiny, and when he entered the room with that same controlled bearing, she found herself studying him with new intensity, searching for the calculation or cruelty that must surely hide behind such an offer, because her experience had taught her that salvation did not arrive without cost. "You have questions," he said, not sitting until she gestured permission, his formality somehow making the moment feel both more and less intimate. "I would be suspicious of you if you did not, Lady Catherine, as accepting a proposal from a near stranger requires either desperation or foolishness, and I do not believe you possess the latter." His directness steadied something in her, and she asked, voice carefully controlled, "What do you truly want from this marriage, Your Grace? You speak of partnership and intelligence, but men of your position marry for alliance, for heirs, for dynasty. What purpose do I serve that could not be better served by a woman who brings wealth and connections rather than merely conversation and competence?" Something flickered in his expression, and he was quiet for a long moment before answering, "My estate is vast, Lady Catherine, and it requires management that extends beyond ledgers and crop rotations. It requires someone who can see the tenants as people rather than resources, who can make decisions of both practical and moral complexity, who can be trusted with real responsibility rather than merely ornamental duties." And she heard truth in his words, but also evasion, the sense that he was offering her pieces of a larger picture while keeping the whole carefully obscured. "And you determined all this from one conversation?" she asked, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice, and watched his mouth curve in something that was not quite a smile. "I am a careful observer, Lady Catherine, and I have made my fortune and maintained my estates through the ability to assess character quickly and accurately. In our conversation, I saw a mind that engages rather than flatters, a spirit that has been compressed by circumstance but not broken, and a dignity that persists despite reduced conditions." He paused, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I saw someone I could respect, and respect is a rarer foundation for marriage than fortune." Catherine felt the words settle into her, and their weight both reassuring and troubling because she sensed layers of meaning she could not yet access, motivations that remained hidden behind his careful honesty. "And if I agree," she said slowly, "what would you expect? What would our marriage be?" His answer came without hesitation, but with a guardedness that confirmed her suspicion that he was not revealing everything. "A partnership, Lady Catherine, a marriage of minds and purpose if not passion, an arrangement that would give you freedom and security and give me a duchess capable of sharing the burdens of my position." The phrase, "if not passion," struck her with unexpected force, clarifying something she had not allowed herself to consider, that this would be a practical arrangement, a rescue but not a romance, and she felt foolish for the small, quickly suppressed disappointment that accompanied the realization. She studied him, this man who offered salvation without demanding surrender, and made her decision with the pragmatism born of limited choices and hard experience. "I accept your proposal, Your Grace," she said, and watched relief and something more complicated cross his features, "though I confess I do so with more questions than answers, and I will guard myself accordingly." He nodded, as though he expected nothing less, and when he suggested they marry in 3 weeks' time, Catherine agreed, closing the door on Lord Pemberton and her uncle's house, while opening another to an uncertain future with a man whose motives remained partially obscured, a stranger who would become her husband, and she felt hope and wariness twined together in her chest like vines around a trellis, supporting and constricting in equal measure. The weeks before the wedding passed in strange suspension, as though Catherine existed between two lives, neither fully belonging to her uncle's cold house nor yet claimed by the future that awaited her, and Sebastian called upon her each afternoon with a regularity that would have been unremarkable in an ordinary courtship, but felt extraordinary given the practical nature of their arrangement, arriving always at 2 o'clock when Uncle Edmund was conveniently absent at his club, his losses mounting and his relief at Catherine's impending departure growing more obvious with each passing day. Sebastian would take her walking in the small park 3 streets distant, where the autumn leaves had turned to bronze and gold and lay in drifts along the paths, and their conversations ranged across subjects that revealed layers she had not expected: his opinions on agricultural reform and tenant welfare, her thoughts on education and the responsibilities of privilege, discussions of poetry and philosophy that built upon that first exchange at the Weatherby residence and expanded into something richer and more complex. She noticed things about him during those walks, small gestures that spoke of thoughtfulness she had not anticipated, the way he positioned himself between her and the street, shielding her from passing carriages and their splatter, how he moderated his longer stride to match her pace without drawing attention to the accommodation. The morning he arrived with a volume of Wordsworth she had mentioned, admiring, a first edition she suspected was quite valuable, presented with casual grace, as though such gifts were inconsequential. He brought her flowers too, not the showy hothouse roses that suitors typically offered, but autumn chrysanthemums in deep burgundy, and when she expressed surprise at his choice, he said simply, "They seem to suit you, beautiful but resilient, thriving when more delicate blooms have faded," and she felt the compliment settle into her chest like warmth spreading from a coal. What surprised her most, however, was his genuine interest in her opinions, the way he solicited her thoughts on matters of estate management, with a seriousness that suggested he truly intended to make her a partner in such decisions, describing situations among his tenants and asking how she would approach them, listening to her answers with an attention that made her feel, for the first time in 2 years, that her mind was valued rather than merely tolerated. She found herself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that frightened her, checking the mantel clock as 2 o'clock approached and feeling her pulse quicken at the sound of his carriage in the street, and she tried to suppress the growing attraction that bloomed treacherous and unwanted in her chest, because he had been clear: partnership, respect, practical arrangement, if not passion, and she would not be foolish enough to mistake his thoughtfulness for something deeper, would not repeat the error of women throughout history who confused consideration with love and found themselves heartbroken when the truth revealed itself. Yet in unguarded moments, she caught herself watching the way afternoon light touched his profile, noticing the rare softness that entered his expression when he spoke of his estate, feeling something flutter dangerous and hopeful when their hands accidentally brushed, and he did not immediately pull away, and she wondered, with equal parts longing and dread, whether this marriage would bring her security but leave her heart perpetually yearning for something he had never promised to give, whether she was trading one form of suffering for another more exquisite, because it would be self-inflicted, born not of another's cruelty, but of her own foolish hope that partnership might somehow transform into something more. The wedding took place on a grey November morning in a small chapel near her uncle's house, the ceremony simple but elegant in its restraint, and Catherine stood in borrowed ivory silk that had belonged to her mother, and felt the surreal quality of the moment wash over her as she spoke vows that would bind her to a man she had known for mere weeks, a stranger who would become her husband-in-law if not yet in truth. Uncle Edmund attended with false graciousness that barely concealed his relief, his satisfaction at ridding himself of responsibility and debt in one efficient transaction, and she felt his presence like a shadow she would soon escape, watching as Sebastian placed a ring of worked gold on her finger with hands that were steady, while her own trembled slightly, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her wonder what thoughts moved behind that controlled exterior. The wedding breakfast was brief and sparsely attended. Only the witnesses required by law and a handful of distant acquaintances who came more from curiosity than affection, and then they were in Sebastian's carriage beginning the journey north to Derbyshire, to Ashbourne Estate, and the life that awaited her there. And Catherine felt the city fall away behind them like chains breaking, each mile putting distance between herself and the cold house, where she had been diminished and dismissed for 2 interminable years. She watched the landscape change through the carriage window as they travelled, London's grey stones giving way to rolling countryside, touched with winter's approaching hand, the trees mostly bare now and the fields brown with harvest's end, and she found herself stealing glances at Sebastian, who sat across from her with a tension she had not observed during their courtship walks, a distance settling over him like frost, as though the act of marrying had created a barrier rather than removed one. He was polite during their journey, solicitous of her comfort during stops to change horses, but the ease of their conversations in the park had vanished, replaced by formal courtesy that made her chest tighten with apprehension, and she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, if the thoughtful suitor had been performance, and the remote stranger beside her was the truth she would now have to navigate. As afternoon surrendered to evening on the second day of travel, Ashbourne Estate emerged from the landscape like something from a painting, vast and beautiful with its honey-coloured stone glowing in the last light, surrounded by parkland that rolled away in carefully managed wilderness, ancient oaks standing sentinel along the drive, and the house itself rising 3 stories with more windows than Catherine could quickly count, grand enough to inspire awe and melancholy in equal measure, because something about its beauty felt lonely, as though the house itself mourned an absence she could not yet name. The carriage swept up the circular drive and stopped before the main entrance, where household staff had assembled in formal welcome, and Sebastian handed her down with impersonal courtesy before introducing her to Mrs. Dawson, the housekeeper whose warm brown eyes and motherly bearing provided the first genuine comfort Catherine had felt since the ceremony, the older woman's curtsy respectful, but her smile reaching her eyes as she said, "Welcome home, Your Grace. We are so very glad you have come." And Catherine felt something in her chest loosen slightly at the words, at the suggestion that here, in this beautiful melancholy house, she might find something that resembled home. Though what her marriage would be within these walls remained uncertain, as the Duke beside her maintained his careful, distant formality, a stranger once more despite the ring that now bound them together in law and name if not yet in heart. Mrs. Dawson led Catherine through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, the house vast beyond anything she had imagined, past rooms whose purposes she could only guess at until they reached the Duchess's chambers in the East Wing, and the housekeeper opened the door onto apartments that were beautiful and elegant and utterly, devastatingly separate from wherever Sebastian would sleep, the sitting room decorated in soft blues and creams with windows overlooking the park, the bedroom beyond appointed with a canopied bed and furnishings that spoke of feminine comfort, but also of solitude, of a duchess who would inhabit her own sphere apart from her husband. Catherine managed to maintain her composure as Mrs. Dawson pointed out the various amenities, the dressing room and the bell pull to summon her lady's maid, but disappointment settled cold and heavy in her chest because she had known this was a practical arrangement, yet some foolish part of her had hoped that marriage might bring intimacy, that the thoughtful man who had walked with her in the park might want her near him, and these separate chambers felt like a pronouncement of distance that would define their union. Sebastian appeared briefly as the housekeeper departed, his manner formal as he inquired whether the rooms were satisfactory, whether she required anything, his politeness perfect and impersonal, as though she were a guest rather than his wife. And when she asked with careful neutrality where his own chambers were located, he gestured vaguely toward the west wing, quite on the other side of the house, he said, and she understood that the physical distance was intentional, a boundary he had established that she was not invited to cross. She questioned silently whether she was merely an ornamental addition to his household, a duchess in name who would manage domestic affairs and appear at his side when required, but remain fundamentally separate from his inner life, and the fear that had plagued her during their courtship returned with renewed force, that she had escaped one form of imprisonment, only to enter another, more gilded, but equally isolating. After Sebastian withdrew with a slight bow and wishes for her rest after the journey, Catherine explored her new rooms with growing melancholy, discovering the thoughtful touches that had been prepared for her arrival, fresh flowers on the writing desk and books she had mentioned enjoying placed on the shelves, evidence of consideration that made the separation somehow worse, because it suggested he cared enough to attend to her comfort, but not enough to want her truly close. Later, as a maid helped her dress for dinner, Catherine ventured into the corridor and discovered that one wing of the house was locked, a series of doors at the far end of the hallway, sealed with a heavy lock that spoke of secrets deliberately kept. And when she inquired, the maid's expression shuttered, and she said only that those rooms had been closed since the late Duchess passed, and His Grace preferred them left undisturbed, which answered nothing and raised a dozen new questions about the shadows that inhabited this beautiful house. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have accommodated 30 but felt cavernous with only 2, Catherine seated at one end of the long table and Sebastian at the other, the distance between them, both literal and metaphorical, as they made polite conversation about the estate and the journey, and inconsequential matters that skimmed the surface of everything important, and she watched him across the expanse of mahogany and silver, and felt the chasm between them widen with each careful, courteous exchange. When the interminable meal finally concluded, and Sebastian rose with formal wishes for her good night, Catherine retreated to her chambers and stood at the window looking out over the darkened park and the beauty of her surroundings, unable to dispel the uncertainty that wound tight around her heart, wondering what her life would be in this grand, lonely house, whether she would find purpose beyond being the Duchess in name, whether the man who had chosen her would ever let her close enough to understand why he held himself so carefully apart. And as she prepared for bed alone in rooms that felt too large and too empty, she questioned whether this marriage would bring her security at the cost of a different kind of suffering, the ache of existing beside someone she could never truly reach, forever separate despite the vows that bound them. Morning arrived with pale winter sunlight filtering through the bedroom windows, and Catherine woke to the soft knock of Mrs. Dawson entering with tea and the gentle announcement that there were household matters requiring the Duchess's attention whenever Her Grace felt prepared to address them. And though Catherine felt adrift in this grand, unfamiliar house, with a husband who kept himself carefully distant, she recognized the offer for what it was: purpose, occupation, a way to be useful rather than merely ornamental in her gilded cage. Mrs. Dawson settled beside her in the sitting room with ledgers and correspondence, her manner warm but respectful as she explained that the previous Duchess, Sebastian's mother, had died 5 years ago, and since then the female management of the estate had been somewhat neglected, not from deliberate disregard, but from the simple absence of a woman to oversee the household accounts and tenant welfare, and the 100 small details that made a great house run smoothly, and Catherine felt something kindle in her chest at the realization that here was work that mattered, responsibility that would give shape to her days beyond wondering what her marriage would become. The housekeeper spoke of Sebastian's mother with obvious affection and lingering grief, describing a gentle woman who had loved the estate and its people, and Catherine filed away this information about the woman whose chambers she now occupied, sensing there were depths to that history that Mrs. Dawson's careful words only hinted at, shadows that perhaps explained some of Sebastian's remoteness, though she could not yet see their full shape. Catherine spent the morning reviewing accounts and staff arrangements, discovering she had a natural aptitude for organization that had been wasted in her uncle's house, where she had been permitted no meaningful occupation, and by afternoon, Mrs. Dawson suggested visits to some of the tenant families so the new Duchess might introduce herself, and Catherine agreed with an eagerness that surprised her, hungry for connection and purpose after 2 years of isolation and these first lonely days at Ashbourne. The tenant cottages were scattered across the estate, well-maintained structures that spoke of a landlord who cared for his people's welfare, even if he kept himself emotionally distant, and Catherine was received with cautious warmth that grew genuine as she listened to their concerns and asked thoughtful questions and made notes about repairs needed and children's illnesses and the dozen small matters that affect their daily lives. And she saw in their eyes a hope that perhaps this new Duchess would be like the last one, someone who saw them as people rather than merely sources of rent. Mrs. Cooper at Rose Cottage offered tea and spoke of how the late Duchess had visited when her youngest was born, bringing linens and staying to help when the birth proved difficult. And Mr. Pemberton at the mill mentioned how Her Grace used to bring books for his daughters who loved reading, and with each story, Catherine understood more clearly the void her predecessor's death had left, and the opportunity now before her to fill it, to matter to these people, and to build something meaningful, even if her marriage remained uncertain. She returned to the main house as twilight gathered, tired but feeling less adrift than she had since arriving, and as she crossed the entrance hall she glimpsed Sebastian standing in the doorway of his study, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Something in his grey eyes that might have been approval or longing or simply acknowledgement, and though he said nothing beyond a formal inquiry about her day, and she responded with equal formality about the tenant visits, she felt the weight of his gaze follow her as she climbed the stairs, and she wondered what he thought as he observed her beginning to inhabit the role of Duchess, whether he was pleased or merely satisfied that his practical arrangement was functioning as intended, whether some part of him might want more than the careful distance he maintained between them. The crisis came on a grey morning in late November, when word arrived that little Thomas Cooper at Rose Cottage had taken desperately ill in the night, fever raging so high his mother feared for his life, and Catherine did not hesitate or wait for permission, but immediately ordered the carriage and sent a rider for Dr. Matthews in the village, arriving at the cottage to find the child burning with fever and struggling for breath, while his mother clutched him with the helpless terror of a woman who had already lost 2 babies and could not bear to lose another. Catherine rolled up her sleeves and set to work with the calm decisiveness that emerged in her when others needed her strength, drawing on half-remembered knowledge from her own mother's tending of ill tenants years ago. Cool cloths to bring down the fever and careful spoonfuls of water, and the steady reassurance that help was coming, that Thomas would be well, that she would not leave until the crisis passed, and she was still there hours later when Dr. Matthews arrived and confirmed her instincts about the fever and treatment, and she remained still as afternoon faded to evening, helping the doctor and Mrs. Cooper through the worst of it, until finally the child's fever broke and his breathing eased, and the terrible tension in the small cottage released into exhausted relief and grateful tears. She had lost track of time entirely, her dress stained and her hair falling from its pins, and her whole body aching with fatigue, and she did not hear the carriage arrive or footsteps approach until Sebastian's voice cut through the dim cottage with barely controlled intensity, asking, "Where is she?" And then he was there in the doorway, his face stark with something that looked remarkably like fear, and their eyes met across the small room, and Catherine saw his carefully maintained composure falter, crack, something raw and unguarded flashing in his expression before he mastered it again. He crossed to her side and took in the scene with quick assessment, the sleeping child now breathing peacefully, and Mrs. Cooper's tearful gratitude, and Catherine's obvious exhaustion, and without a word, he removed his coat and turned to assist with the remaining tasks, bringing in more water and stoking the fire, and speaking with quiet authority to the doctor about continued care. And when his hand brushed Catherine's as they both reached to adjust the child's blanket, the contact sent a shock through her entire body, his fingers warm and strong and lingering a moment longer than necessary, while something wordless and electric passed between them in the firelit dimness. "Doctor," Matthews finally declared he would stay the night to monitor Thomas, and assured them the worst had passed, and Sebastian guided Catherine to his carriage with a hand at the small of her back that felt protective and possessive and entirely different from his usual careful distance, and she was too exhausted to guard herself as she leaned back against the seat and felt the tears come, reaction and relief, and the overwhelming emotion of the day, and she thought he would retreat into formality as always, but instead he shifted closer and offered his handkerchief and said in a voice rough with suppressed feeling, "You were magnificent, Catherine, absolutely magnificent." And the admiration in his tone made her breath catch, because this was real, not polite, the first fully honest thing he had said to her since their wedding. The carriage moved through the darkness toward the main house, and she felt his gaze on her in the shadows, felt the tension between them shift into something more dangerous and promising, and she gathered her courage and said quietly, "I could not have done otherwise. They are our people, our responsibility," and the word times our times hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning, an assertion of partnership, and she saw him struggle visibly with whatever walls he had built around himself, saw him begin to speak, and then stop and begin again. "Catherine, but whatever confession trembled on his lips remained unspoken, because he retreated back into that maddening, careful distance, even as his hand remained close to hers on the seat between them, and so close she could feel its warmth without touching. And when they arrived at the house and he helped her down, his grip on her hand was gentle and lingering, and full of all the things he would not say, and she went to her separate chambers, feeling frustrated and hopeful and confused all at once, knowing that something had shifted between them in that cottage, that she had seen beyond his armor to the man beneath, but having no idea whether that glimpse would lead to anything more than this aching, almost intimacy that was becoming harder to bear than complete distance would have been. As autumn surrendered to winter's first breath and frost began to silver the morning grass, Catherine found herself settled into a rhythm at Ashbourne that was both deeply satisfying and quietly heartbreaking, for she had transformed the estate management in the months since her arrival, earning the genuine affection of staff and tenants through her tireless attention to their welfare and her ability to balance compassion with practical efficiency. And yet the professional partnership she had built with Sebastian remained just that: professional, courteous, marked by growing respect, but still bounded by the careful distance he maintained, like a wall she could not breach, no matter how she longed to. Their evenings had developed a pattern that she both treasured and found torturous, gathering in the library after dinner, where the fire cast golden light across leather-bound books and comfortable chairs, where they would read in companionable silence, or discuss the day's events, or play chess with a friendly competitiveness that made her forget sometimes the ache in her chest. And these hours were the best of her days, because here Sebastian relaxed incrementally, his austere features softening as they debated philosophy or literature, his rare smile appearing when she made a clever move on the chessboard or offered an observation that surprised him, and she hoarded these smiles like precious things, evidence that beneath his careful reserve lived a man of warmth and humor and deep feeling that he simply would not allow her to fully reach. She had fallen in love with him completely and helplessly, somewhere between that night at the tenant cottage and these quiet library evenings, had fallen in love with his intelligence and integrity, and the glimpses of tenderness he showed when he thought she was not observing. The way he listened to tenant concerns with genuine attention, the care he took with estate decisions that affected people's lives, the grief that sometimes shadowed his eyes when he looked at her as though he wanted something he believed he could not have. And Catherine's love was a constant sweet ache beneath her breastbone, growing stronger with each passing day, while remaining entirely unspoken because she sensed that he was not ready to hear it, and that something in his past had wounded him so deeply that he could not yet risk vulnerability, no matter what she saw reflected in those grey eyes during their unguarded moments. The estate had become truly hers in these months. She knew every family and their circumstances, had reorganized the household accounts and improved efficiency while ensuring staff were well treated, had established a small school for tenant children and a lending library, and a dozen other improvements that made daily life better for those who depended on Ashbourne. And she felt pride in this work and felt purposeful and needed and valued. But oh, she wanted more than respect and partnership, wanted the right to touch her husband's face and smooth away the tension that lined it, wanted to wake beside him rather than alone in her grand separate chambers, wanted him to look at her with desire rather than whatever complicated emotion he kept so carefully locked away, and the wanting was becoming almost unbearable, as emotional intimacy grew in their evening conversations, while physical distance remained absolute. He never touched her beyond the most formal courtesies, never let his hand linger or his guard drop, except in those rare moments that seemed to surprise him as much as her. And Catherine found herself caught between gratitude for what she had: safety, purpose, companionship, respect, and longing for what she did not have, and she wondered with increasing desperation whether this careful half-marriage was all she would ever know, whether Sebastian's demons would forever keep him locked away from her, whether she should accept this comfortable partnership and stop yearning for the impossible, stop hoping that someday he might love her the way she loved him, stop imagining what it would feel like if he finally let himself reach for her across the careful space he maintained between them, like a chasm she could see but not cross. Catherine's curiosity about the locked wing had grown from mild interest to consuming need as the weeks passed, for it represented everything Sebastian kept hidden from her, and she told herself that understanding his past might give her the key to reaching his present, to breaching those walls he maintained so carefully around his heart. And the opportunity came on a grey December afternoon, when Sebastian had ridden out to inspect drainage work on the far fields. And Mrs. Dawson had taken the afternoon to visit her sister in the village, leaving Catherine alone in the quiet house with estate correspondence to manage. She had gone to Sebastian's study to retrieve the ledgers he had mentioned that morning, And as she searched his impeccably organized desk for the correct volume, her hand brushed against a small wooden box tucked in the back of a drawer, and inside that box lay a single iron key on a faded ribbon, and she knew with absolute certainty what lock it would open, even as her conscience whispered that she was crossing a boundary, violating the privacy he had silently demanded she respect. But her need to understand him overwhelmed her scruples, and she took the key with trembling hands and made her way through the silent corridors to the locked wing she had passed dozens of times without entering. The key turned smoothly, despite years of disuse, and the door swung open onto a long gallery, thick with dust and shadows, where Holland covers draped over furniture made ghostly shapes in the dim light, filtering through curtained windows, and Catherine moved through the space with growing sorrow as she uncovered the remnants of a life deliberately preserved and abandoned simultaneously. Finding first a portrait gallery where generations of Thornfield ancestors stared down from gilded frames, with expressions ranging from stern to kind, but stopping her breath entirely when she reached the largest portrait, a family grouping that showed Sebastian as a boy of perhaps 12, standing beside a beautiful woman with sad eyes and gentle smile, while a cold-faced man with Sebastian's features rendered cruel and hard stood apart from them, both, and the body language in that painting told its own story of isolation and unhappiness, despite the formal composition. She moved deeper into the wing and found the preserved chambers of the late Duchess, rooms frozen in time as though their occupant might return at any moment, and here Catherine discovered the diaries, leather-bound volumes stacked on a writing desk. And though she knew she should not read them, she could not stop herself from opening one and then another, drawn into the painful chronicle of a woman who had been married at 18 for her enormous dowry to a man who had wanted only her money and despised everything else about her, who had treated her with systematic cruelty disguised as civility, who had broken her spirit year by year through contempt and coldness and the clear communication that she was valued only for what she had brought to the marriage and found wanting in every other respect. The Duchess had written of her son Sebastian with fierce protective love, of her terror that he would become like his father, of her attempts to shield him from the worst of his father's nature, and the final entries from just before her death spoke of her relief that the old Duke had died first, and her desperate hope that Sebastian would not let his father's poison destroy his capacity for love, would not mistake his father's obsession with advantageous marriages and financial gain for wisdom, would not become cold and closed as a protection against vulnerability. And Catherine sat in that dusty chamber with tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the fear that drove Sebastian's distance, understood that he had married her specifically because she came without fortune, had chosen her as proof that he was different from his father, but in his determination not to repeat his father's mercenary cruelty, had instead trapped himself in a different kind of prison, one where he dared not risk his heart even with a woman who would cherish it, and she wept for his mother, who had suffered so terribly, and for Sebastian, who was still suffering from wounds he would not let heal, and for herself who loved a man too haunted to accept that love, and she did not hear his footsteps in the corridor, or know he had returned early, until his voice cut through the dusty silence like a blade, saying her name with such controlled fury that she knew she had crossed a line from which there might be no return. Catherine rose from the writing desk with the diary still clutched in her hands, her tear-streaked face turning toward where Sebastian stood in the doorway like an avenging angel, his riding coat still dusty from the fields, and his grey eyes burning with an emotion she could not entirely name. Fury, certainly, but beneath it, something raw and more desperate, something that looked almost like fear. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and her voice broke on the words because she was sorry for intruding but not sorry for understanding, not sorry for finally glimpsing the truth that had shaped their strange half-marriage, and she watched as he moved into the room with controlled precision that barely masked the tension radiating from every line of his body, watched as his gaze swept across his mother's preserved chambers and the open diary in Catherine's hands and the evidence of tears on her face, and something in his expression cracked slightly, the anger fracturing to reveal the pain beneath. "You had no right," he said, and each word was carefully measured as though he feared what might escape if he let his control slip even slightly. "These rooms are locked for a reason. These memories are not yours to examine like some curiosity in a museum. But Catherine heard the anguish underneath the accusation, and she set down the diary with gentle reverence before turning to face him fully, her own tears still falling but her voice steady when she replied. "I needed to understand," she said softly. "I needed to understand why you hold yourself so carefully apart, why you married me but will not let yourself truly be married, why you look at me sometimes as though you want something you dare not reach for." And she saw him flinch at her words, saw his hands clench and unclench at his sides as though he were fighting some internal battle. And then something broke in him, and the words began pouring out in a torrent that seemed to surprise him as much as her. He told her everything, standing there in his mother's dusty chambers, with afternoon light slanting through curtained windows, told her how his father had courted his mother for her enormous dowry, and nothing else, had married her for financial advantage, and treated her ever after with contempt thinly veiled as civility, and had made clear through 1,000 small cruelties that she was valued only for what she had brought to the marriage, and found wanting in every other respect. How Sebastian had watched his gentle mother slowly break under the weight of being unloved and unwanted, despite her efforts to be the perfect duchess, how she had died, with sadness, still shadowing her eyes, and her last words to her son had been a plea that he not let his father's poison destroy his capacity for happiness. "He married for money and it made him a monster," Sebastian said, and his voice had gone hoarse with emotion. "He took a woman's fortune and gave her nothing but misery in return, and I swore I would never repeat his mistakes, and would never marry for advantage or wealth or anything. But," he stopped abruptly, turning away from her as though he could not bear to finish the thought, and Catherine moved toward him slowly, carefully, as one might approach a wounded creature that might bolt or strike out from pain. "But don't you see," she said gently, standing close enough now that she could have touched him though she did not yet dare, "you've trapped yourself in a different kind of prison. You've married to prove you're not your father, but then refuse to let the marriage be real, refuse to let yourself feel anything, because you're so terrified of becoming what he was." And she watched his shoulders tense at her words, watched the truth of them land like blows. He turned back to her then, and his face was raw with the vulnerability he had kept hidden for so long, and he said quietly, "I chose you because you came without fortune, because I could prove to myself that I was different from him, that I could want a woman for her character and intelligence rather than her dowry. But Catherine," and here his voice dropped to almost a whisper, "I have wanted you from that first evening at the Weatherby residence, have wanted you with an intensity that terrifies me, because wanting leads to possession, and possession leads to the kind of cruelty my father showed my mother, and I will not become that man." Catherine felt her heart break and mend simultaneously at his confession, understanding finally the terrible logic that had kept him distant, the fear that had masqueraded as coldness, and she reached out slowly to lay her hand against his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palm, and she said with quiet certainty, "Your father's sin was not in wanting your mother. It was in not wanting her enough, in valuing her money above her heart. But Sebastian, I have no money for you to value above me. I came to you with nothing, and you have treated me with nothing but respect and kindness, and that is not your father's pattern, that is your own." She felt him trembling slightly beneath her touch, felt the decades of fear and self-protection warring with the longing she could see in his eyes, and though he did not pull her close or declare his feelings or break down the final walls between them, he covered her hand with his own and held it there against his heart, and for a long moment they stood together in those chambers, haunted by his mother's sorrow, and Catherine felt the first fragile threads of genuine connection forming between them, even as she sensed that he was not yet ready to surrender fully to vulnerability, not yet ready to risk the intimacy she offered, but it was a beginning, a crack in the armor he had worn for so long, and she would be patient because she finally understood that his distance had never been about her inadequacy, but about his own terrible fear of becoming the man who had destroyed his mother's happiness. And understanding, she thought, was its own kind of progress toward the love she hoped might someday be possible between them. The days following their confrontation in the locked wing settled into a pattern that felt both more intimate and more fragile than before, for Sebastian had revealed enough of his wounds that Catherine understood his distance, but not enough to bridge it, and she found herself caught in a peculiar torment of loving a man who remained just beyond her reach, close enough to touch but too guarded to truly hold, and her frustration grew not from anger, but from a desperate longing that intensified with each evening they spent together in the library, each careful conversation that danced around the edges of deeper feeling without ever plunging into its depths, each moment when their eyes met, and she saw the want in his gaze, before he shuttered it away behind practiced courtesy, and she thought she might go mad from the ache of it, from loving someone who seemed determined to protect himself even at the cost of their shared happiness. And so it was that on a cold January evening, when they sat together in the library as had become their custom, she, by the fire, with needlework she was not attending to, and he at his desk reviewing correspondence he was not actually reading, Catherine felt something inside her finally break under the weight of all the unspoken words and unexpressed feeling, and she set down her needlework with deliberate care and said his name with enough quiet force that he looked up from his letters with surprise and perhaps the faintest touch of apprehension. "I cannot continue this way," she said, and her voice was steady though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "I cannot continue existing in this half-marriage where we are partners in all things except the ones that matter most, where you look at me with warmth but will not let me close, where we build a life together but remain fundamentally separate." And she watched him set down his pen with careful precision, watched the walls rising in his expression, even as she forced herself to continue speaking truths that terrified her to voice. "I understand now what you fear," she said, standing, because she could not remain seated for what she needed to say, moving to stand before the fire, where its warmth might ease the chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "I understand that your father's cruelty has taught you to fear your own capacity for harm, that you believe wanting someone too much will somehow transform you into the monster he was. But Sebastian," and here her voice broke slightly, but she pushed through because this might be her only chance to reach him, "I didn't come to you with fortune, but I came with heart. I came with all of myself, and you have accepted my usefulness and my partnership, but you will not accept my love, and I begin to fear that I am merely another piece of your household management, valued for what I do but not for who I am, not for the woman who loves you so desperately that it has become a physical ache inside my chest." She saw him stand abruptly, saw something flash across his face that looked like pain and longing tangled together, and she forced herself to hold his gaze as she continued. "I was trapped in my uncle's house, trapped in a life where I had no value beyond what money he could extract from my existence. And you offered me escape, but Sebastian, I have only traded one kind of prison for another, and this one is worse because I love my jailer, because I see the man you could be if you would only let yourself, because I catch glimpses of your heart and then watch you lock it away again, and I am so very tired of being held at arm's length by the only person I have ever truly wanted to be close to." The silence that followed her words was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the sound of their breathing, and Catherine felt the full vulnerability of her confession settling over her like a weight, felt the terrible exposure of having laid her heart bare before someone who might not want it, and when Sebastian took a step toward her and then stopped as though fighting himself, when she saw the war raging in his eyes between longing and fear, between the desire to reach for what she offered and the terror of what reaching might mean, she felt her fragile hope beginning to crumble, felt the certainty growing that she had pushed too hard and revealed too much, and lost whatever tentative connection they had managed to build. "I understand if you cannot give me what I need," she said softly, and her dignity in this moment of supreme vulnerability was perhaps her finest quality. "I understand that your wounds go deep, and that healing is not simply a matter of wanting to be whole, but I needed you to know that I am here not because I have nowhere else to go, not because I am grateful for rescue, but because I chose you and continue choosing you every day, and if all you can offer me is partnership and friendship, then I will accept it, because being near you in any capacity is better than being without you entirely. But I will always grieve for what we might have been if you could have let yourself love me as I love you." And with those words still hanging in the air between them, words that felt like both confession and farewell, Catherine turned away from him because she could not bear to see rejection in his eyes, could not watch him retreat again behind his carefully maintained walls, and she moved toward the library door with as much grace as she could summon, though she felt as though she were shattering inside. And she had almost reached the threshold when his voice stopped her, a single broken word That was her name, spoken with such anguish that she turned back despite herself, to find him standing frozen by the fire, his face stripped of all its usual careful control, his hands clenched at his sides, and his entire body rigid with the effort of containing whatever storm raged within him. And for a long moment they simply looked at each other across the space of the library, and then, without another word, he turned and walked from the room, leaving Catherine alone with the dying fire and the terrible certainty that she had finally pushed him too far, that her vulnerability had not opened his heart, but had instead driven him further into the isolation he seemed determined to maintain. And she sank into the chair he had vacated and let the tears finally come, crying not from anger, but from the profound sorrow of loving someone who could not let himself be loved. And she wept there alone until the fire burned low, and the cold began creeping into the room, and she thought that perhaps this was her fate, to be forever reaching for warmth that would always remain just beyond her grasp, to love a man who had chosen his fear over his heart, and the weight of that realization was almost more than she could bear. Sebastian walked through the darkened corridors of Ashbourne with no destination in mind, only the desperate need to escape the library and Catherine's words that still echoed in his ears with devastating clarity, and he found himself eventually in his study, where he had spent so many solitary hours managing his estates and maintaining the careful control that had governed his life since his mother's death. But tonight that control had shattered like fine crystal struck too hard, and he stood by the window, looking out over the winter-dark grounds, seeing nothing but Catherine's face as she had confessed her love and her despair, hearing nothing but the dignity in her voice as she had laid bare the truth he had been too cowardly to acknowledge even to himself. Asterisk. I have only traded one kind of prison for another, and this one is worse because I love my jailer. Asterisk. The words struck him repeatedly like blows, and he pressed his forehead against the cold glass, as though the winter chill might somehow numb the anguish spreading through his chest. The terrible understanding that in his determination not to become his father, he had instead created his own particular variety of cruelty, one that wore the mask of propriety and protection, but was no less damaging for its gentleness, and he saw with brutal clarity that he had taken Catherine from one form of captivity, her uncle's house, where she was valued only for her stolen dowry, and placed her in another where she was valued for everything except what she most wanted to give him, her heart, her love, the intimacy that should have been the foundation of their marriage, but which he had withheld from her day after day out of his own suffocating fear. He thought of his father, that cold tyrant who had married his gentle mother for her enormous fortune and then spent 20 years demonstrating his contempt for the woman herself, who had valued wealth above humanity and had slowly poisoned the very air of Ashbourne with his bitterness and cruelty. And Sebastian had sworn he would never repeat that pattern, had chosen Catherine specifically because she came without fortune, so that he could prove to himself that he was different, and that he could want a woman for her character rather than her dowry. But he saw now with devastating clarity that he had been so focused on not repeating his father's specific sins that he had failed to see how he was committing his own, how withholding love and intimacy was its own form of cruelty regardless of his intentions, how his mother would have been just as destroyed if his father had married her without mercenary motive, but then refused to actually love her, for the absence of love was agony, whether it stemmed from contempt or from fear. The hours of that night stretched endlessly, as Sebastian sat in his darkened study wrestling with truths he had spent months avoiding, and he remembered with painful vividness the evening at the Weatherby residence when he had first seen Catherine, how something in her quiet dignity and unaffected intelligence had reached past all his carefully constructed defenses and made him want in a way he had not permitted himself to want anything in years, how he had investigated her circumstances through discreet channels and learned of her uncle's theft and her desperate situation, and had told himself he was offering her a practical arrangement when the truth was that he had wanted her from that first conversation about philosophy and literature, had wanted her with an intensity that terrified him precisely because it reminded him too much of how his father had wanted his mother's money, and in his fear of that wanting, Sebastian had denied it, had channeled it into acceptable forms of partnership and respect and careful distance, had given Catherine everything except the one thing she actually needed, his heart freely offered without the armor of self-protection that had kept him safe, but had also kept him alone. He thought of his mother in those final weeks before illness claimed her, how she had called him to her bedside and taken his hand with her failing strength, and said with desperate urgency, "Don't let your father's poison destroy your capacity for happiness. Don't let his cruelty teach you to be cruel in return. Even if that cruelty is only against yourself, promise me you will let yourself love someone, Sebastian. Promise me you won't spend your life as alone as I have been." And he had promised, though he had not truly understood what she was asking. He had not realized that protecting oneself from pain also meant protecting oneself from joy, and he knew with crushing certainty that if she could see him now, she would recognize in his careful distance the same lovelessness that had destroyed her own marriage, would see that he had broken his promise, not through becoming his father, but through becoming the opposite extreme, through choosing isolation over the risk of causing harm. As the night wore slowly toward dawn, Sebastian sat with his head in his hands and forced himself to truly look at what he had done, forced himself to see Catherine not, as he had been telling himself to see her, a partner, a capable duchess, a woman he respected but as she actually was, the woman who had transformed Ashbourne through her quiet competence and genuine care, who had won the love of every tenant and servant through simple kindness, who had looked at him in the library with tears streaming down her face and confessed that she loved him despite having every reason not to, who had come to their marriage with nothing and had given everything and had asked for only one thing in return, the one thing he had been too frightened to offer. And he understood finally that Catherine was nothing like the fortune hunters his father had always feared, lurked behind every feminine smile, that she had chosen him when she had absolutely nothing to gain, had stayed with him through months of his emotional withdrawal, had loved him not for his title or his wealth, but for the man she somehow saw beneath all his careful defenses. And the question that tormented him through those dark hours was not whether she deserved his love, she so clearly did, but whether he had the courage to give it to her, whether he could dismantle the walls he had built so carefully over so many years and risk the vulnerability that love required, risk the possibility of becoming something he feared, or of losing what he loved, or simply of failing at something that mattered more than anything had ever mattered before. Dawn came slowly, winter light creeping across the grounds and through the study windows, and Sebastian watched it come with eyes that burned from sleeplessness and the tears he had finally permitted himself to shed, and he thought of Catherine probably in her chambers, wondering if she had destroyed whatever fragile connection they had built, probably believing that her confession had driven him away, when the truth was that her words had been the most precious gift anyone had ever offered him. And he knew with absolute clarity, born of that long dark night, that he had to find the courage his mother had begged him to have, had to risk the vulnerability that terrified him, had to go to Catherine and offer her not the careful partnership he had maintained for months, but the whole truth of his heart, with all its wounds and fears and desperate longing, because the alternative was to continue this half-life that protected him from nothing except happiness, and condemned them both to the same cold existence that had destroyed his parents' marriage, and he could not, would not, do that to Catherine or to himself any longer. And so, as the sun finally broke above the horizon, casting pale gold light across the frost-covered grounds, he rose from his chair with resolution settling over him, like armor of a different kind, the kind that made one vulnerable rather than defended, and he walked from his study, knowing that what he was about to do terrified him more than anything he had ever attempted, but knowing also that some risks were worth taking, that some loves were worth the fear, and that Catherine deserved nothing less than the full truth of everything he had been too afraid to acknowledge, even to himself. Catherine had not slept that night after leaving the library, had instead sat in the window seat of her chambers, watching the darkness gradually give way to winter dawn, while wondering if her confession had cost her the fragile connection she and Sebastian had built over these months, and she felt hollowed out by grief and vulnerability, by the terrible exposure of having laid her heart bare, only to watch him walk away. And when the soft knock came at her chamber door just after sunrise, she assumed it was her maid and called permission to enter without turning from the window. But the footsteps that crossed her sitting room were heavier than Mary's light tread, and when she turned with surprise that transformed instantly to shock, she found Sebastian standing in her doorway, propriety maintained by the open door and the earliness of the hour when servants moved through corridors, but intimacy, unmistakable in his presence, in this most private of spaces, and the sight of him stole what remained of her composure, for he looked as though he had not slept at all, his dark hair disheveled as though he had run his hands through it repeatedly, his cravat missing and his shirt open at the throat in a state of undress she had never seen him permit, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath catch, and he stood there for a long moment, simply looking at her, as though memorizing her features, while she remained frozen in her window seat, unable to move or speak or do anything, but stare back at him with her heart hammering against her ribs. "I need to tell you something," he said finally, and his voice was rough with sleeplessness and emotion barely contained. "And I need you to let me say it all before you respond, because if I stop, I may not have the courage to continue." And Catherine nodded mutely as he moved further into the room, but maintained a careful distance as though afraid that proximity might scatter his resolve. And she watched him gather himself visibly, he watched him take a breath that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, before he began speaking words that would reshape everything between them. That evening at the Weatherby residence when we first met, when we spoke of philosophy and literature and you looked at me with such unaffected intelligence, something in me recognized you as though I had been waiting my entire life without knowing what I was waiting for, he said, and his hands were clenched at his sides, as though physical tension might help him maintain emotional control. "I investigated your circumstances afterward, and I told myself I was being practical, that I was simply gathering information about a potential alliance. But the truth is that I was looking for reasons to justify what I already wanted, which was you. And when I learned of your uncle's theft and your desperate situation, I convinced myself I was offering rescue, when what I was actually doing was creating an opportunity to have what I had wanted from that first conversation." And Catherine felt tears beginning to slide down her cheeks as he continued, as the careful control he had maintained for months finally crumbled before her eyes. "I chose you for your heart and your mind and your quiet strength. I chose you because something in your dignity, despite reduced circumstances, spoke to something in me that I had thought my father's cruelty had destroyed. But I was terrified, Catherine. I was so desperately afraid that wanting you the way I did made me like him, made me capable of the same destruction he had wrought on my mother, and so I convinced myself that distance was protection, that if I kept myself carefully controlled and maintained proper boundaries, I could prove I was different from him, that I could want you without harming you. But I see now that I was wrong," and his voice broke slightly on those last words, and he moved closer to her, though still maintaining space between them, as though he needed to finish his confession before allowing himself the comfort of proximity. "I have spent these months giving you everything except what you actually needed, offering you partnership and respect and careful courtesy while withholding the one thing that mattered, which was my heart freely given. And last night when you stood in the library and told me you had traded one prison for another, when you said you loved your jailer, I finally understood that in trying so desperately not to repeat my father's cruelty, I had created my own particular variety of it, because withholding love is its own form of harm regardless of the reasons behind it. And now he did close the distance between them, did come to kneel before her window seat, so that they were eye to eye, and Catherine could see the tears on his own face matching hers, could see the absolute vulnerability in his expression as he continued, "I chose you for your heart, Catherine, and then I stayed distant to protect mine, but I cannot do it anymore. I cannot continue this half-existence when you are offering me everything, and the truth is that I have loved you for months, have loved you perhaps from that first evening, though I was too much a coward to acknowledge it even to myself. And I am so deeply sorry for every moment I have made you feel less than cherished when you are the most precious thing in my life." The silence that followed his words was absolute except for the sound of their breathing and the distant calls of servants beginning the day's work, and Catherine reached out with trembling hands to cup his face, feeling the roughness of his unshaven jaw beneath her palms, seeing the hope and fear and desperate love in his eyes. And when she finally found her voice, it emerged as barely more than a whisper but carried the weight of all the emotion she had suppressed for so long. "I love you, Sebastian. I have loved you through your distance and your careful control and your determination to protect yourself at the cost of us both, and I will love you through whatever comes next, through the vulnerability that terrifies you and the healing that must happen, and all the days of our life together, if you will only let me. if you will only accept what I have been trying to give you since the beginning, which is simply everything I am." And with those words, the last barrier between them finally shattered, and Sebastian pulled her from the window seat into his arms with a sound that was half laugh and half sob, holding her as though she were something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. And Catherine buried her face against his neck and felt the wetness of his tears mixing with her own, and they clung to each other in the pale winter morning light, as though they had both been drowning and had finally found solid ground. And for the first time since their wedding day, Catherine felt the full truth of what marriage could be. Not partnership alone, but the complete intertwining of two souls who had finally found the courage to be wholly themselves with each other. Their first kiss happened in that pale winter morning light, with the sounds of Ashbourne waking around them, and it was nothing like Catherine had imagined during all those lonely months. It was not passionate or desperate, but rather tender and tentative and infinitely precious, like something too fragile to be rushed, and Sebastian held her face between his hands, with a reverence that made her heart ache as he lowered his mouth to hers, with a gentleness that spoke of both desire and restraint, and of wanting her completely while honoring the newness of this vulnerability between them. And when their lips finally met, Catherine felt something fundamental shift in the world, felt the last walls between them dissolve like morning mist beneath sun, and the kiss tasted of tears and hope, and the beginning of something neither had believed they deserved, but which had found them anyway, despite all their defenses. When they finally drew apart, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers and released a breath that sounded like relief after years of holding it, and Catherine could feel him trembling slightly, as though the magnitude of what had passed between them had shaken loose something he had kept tightly bound for far too long, and she reached up to thread her fingers through his disheveled dark hair and whispered, "We are going to be quite all right, you know." And she felt rather than saw his smile against her temple as he gathered her closer and murmured, "Yes, I believe we might be, though I have no idea how to do this, how to be what you deserve." And Catherine pulled back just enough to meet his eyes with steady conviction, and replied, "You learn it the same way I am learning to be a duchess, by trying and failing and trying again." Together. They spent that morning in Catherine's sitting room with proper attention to propriety. The door remained open, and Mary brought tea at appropriate intervals, though the maid's knowing smile suggested the door. Household staff was aware something significant had shifted, and they talked with the kind of honesty that should perhaps have come before their wedding vows, but which arrived now like a gift neither had known to ask for. And Sebastian told her about his mother's final days, and the promise he had made, and how terribly he had misunderstood what she had been asking of him. And Catherine spoke of her parents' loving marriage, and how their deaths had left her not just bereaved, but unmoored from any sense of her own worth, how her uncle's theft had felt like confirmation that she had no value beyond what money she could bring. And as they shared these wounds with each other, the morning light strengthened, and the winter sun climbed higher, and gradually the terrible isolation that had surrounded them both began to lift like fever breaking. "I want to court you properly," Sebastian said suddenly as the mantel clock chimed noon, and Catherine looked at him with confusion that transformed to wonder as he continued, "I know we are already married. I know propriety says the courtship should have preceded the vows, but I want to do this correctly, Catherine. I want to give you the romance and attention you should have had from the beginning. I want to learn your favorite things and bring you flowers and walk with you in gardens and earn your love, rather than simply accepting it as though I had any right to it." And Catherine felt tears threatening again at the earnestness in his voice, at this proud man who had spent months maintaining careful control, now asking permission to woo his own wife. And she took his hand and pressed it to her cheek and said, "You already have my love, Sebastian. You have had it for longer than I care to admit. But yes, let us begin again. Let us build what we should have built from the start, a marriage based not on arrangement or rescue, but on genuine partnership and affection and absolute honesty." That evening they walked together through Ashbourne's winter and gardens as the sun set in brilliant shades of gold and rose over the frost-covered grounds, and they walked hand in hand, which was such a simple thing, but which felt revolutionary after months of careful distance. And Sebastian pointed out the places where his mother had once cultivated roses and where he hoped to restore the gardens in spring, and Catherine shared her ideas for expanding the tenant cottages and establishing a small school for the children. and the conversation flowed easily between practical matters and personal revelations, between silence, comfortable enough to simply exist together, and words that built understanding between them. And when they passed a bench overlooking the frozen ornamental pond, Sebastian drew her to sit beside him and wrapped his greatcoat around her shoulders against the cold, and said quietly, "I want you to know that from this moment forward, you are my true partner in everything, not just household matters, but estate decisions and financial planning, and all the aspects of our life together. I will hide nothing from you, and I will value your counsel above all others, and I hope eventually you will forgive me for the months I wasted in fear when I could have had this, had you, and had us." Catherine leaned against his shoulder and watched their breath mist in the cold air, and felt happiness spreading through her chest like warmth from a carefully tended fire, and she realized that she was laughing, quiet laughter, born not of humor but of pure joy, at the strangeness and beauty of how completely her life had transformed in the span of a single night and morning. And Sebastian looked down at her, and with such open adoration that it stole her breath, and she pulled his head down to kiss him again there in the winter gardens, with the stars beginning to appear overhead. And this kiss was less tentative than the first, carried more promise and passion, while maintaining that underlying tenderness that characterized everything between them now. And when they finally returned to the manor house, as full darkness fell, they did so with arms around each other, and with the easy affection of lovers who had finally found their way home to one another after too long wandering separately in the cold. Winter melted into spring, and with it the last frost between them, and those months became a season of transformation more profound than mere changing weather, as Catherine and Sebastian discovered what their marriage could be when built upon the foundation of absolute honesty and freely given love, rather than careful distance and protective restraint. And Sebastian proved true to his word about courting her properly, bringing her flowers from the conservatory each morning, first the forced bulbs of late winter, and then the early roses as the season progressed, and leaving books of poetry on her desk with passages marked that spoke of things he still found difficult to say aloud. And Catherine responded in kind with small gestures of affection that delighted him precisely because they were unexpected, pressing preserved flowers into his correspondence, or leaving notes in his study that he would find hours later and that never failed to make him smile. And gradually, the careful politeness that had characterized their early months together gave way to something far more precious, which was the easy intimacy of two people learning to be completely themselves with one another without fear of judgment or rejection. They opened the locked wing together on a bright March morning, when sunlight streamed through windows that had been shuttered for years, and Catherine stood beside Sebastian as he looked at his mother's portrait, with tears on his face, and said quietly that he wanted to transform these rooms from a shrine to grief into something that honored joy instead, something that looked toward future rather than past. And so together they began the work of converting the space into a nursery and adjoining chambers, choosing wallpaper with cheerful patterns and commissioning furniture that spoke of hope rather than sorrow. And Sebastian involved Catherine in every decision, as though her opinion was not merely valued but essential, and she watched him gradually release the grip his father's cruelty had maintained on his life, and saw him becoming the man his mother had always believed he could be, someone capable of tenderness without shame and love without restraint. Sebastian wrote to his sister Beatrice, whom he had allowed distance to grow between them after their mother's death, and Catherine sat with him as he composed the letter with shaking hands, and admitted that he had been wrong to retreat from family when grief overwhelmed him. And when Beatrice responded with forgiveness and joy, and the news that she would visit in May, Catherine held Sebastian as he wept with relief. And when his sister finally arrived, a lovely woman of 28, with Sebastian's dark eyes and their mother's gentle manner, Catherine watched the siblings repair what years of pain and avoidance had fractured. They watched them laugh together and share memories and begin building new bonds. And Beatrice pulled Catherine aside during her visit and said with tears in her eyes, "You have given me back my brother. You have somehow reached the places none of us could touch and brought him home to himself." And Catherine embraced her and replied, "He saved himself. He simply needed to believe he was worth saving." And the friendship that formed between the two women became another gift in a season full of unexpected grace. Their partnership extended to every aspect of their life together, as Sebastian made good on his promise to hide nothing and value Catherine's counsel above all others, and they spent long evenings reviewing estate accounts and planning improvements to tenant properties and discussing investments and charitable works, and Catherine discovered that she had a natural aptitude for the administrative aspects of managing a large estate, and that Sebastian delighted in her suggestions and implemented them with enthusiasm, and together they established a school for tenant children and expanded the estate clinic and created a system for supporting families during difficult seasons, and the people of Ashbourne responded to their Duchess with deep affection because she had proven herself not merely interested in their welfare, but genuinely committed to their flourishing, and when she and Sebastian rode through the estate together, the tenants would wave and call greetings, and Catherine would feel such overwhelming gratitude for this life she had stumbled into, when she had expected nothing but duty and obligation. The physical intimacy between them developed with the same tenderness that characterized everything in their transformed marriage, and Sebastian was demonstrative with his affection now, as though making up for the months of careful distance, reaching for her hand during dinner and kissing her temple when he passed her in corridors and pulling her into his arms in the library when they were alone. And their wedding night came months late, but arrived with all the sweetness and passion that Catherine had not dared to hope for, and afterward as they lay together in the darkness of Sebastian's chambers, which had become their shared chambers, as all pretense of separation dissolved, he whispered against her hair that he had never imagined he could be this happy, that she had given him something he had not known he was missing, which was simply the freedom to love without fear, and Catherine pressed closer to him and felt complete in a way she had not experienced since her parents' deaths, felt finally that she had found home not just in a place but in a person, and the happiness that settled over Ashbourne, that spring was palpable to everyone who witnessed it, the kind of joy that comes not from the absence of struggle, but from the hard-won victory of choosing vulnerability over safety and connection over isolation. And both Sebastian and Catherine understood that they had been given something precious and rare, which was a second chance to build their marriage correctly after nearly destroying it through fear and protective distance, and they were determined not to waste a single moment of the gift they had been granted. The intrusion came on a golden afternoon in late May, when the apple blossoms were in full bloom, and Catherine was reviewing household accounts in the morning room, with windows open to the garden breeze, and she heard the commotion in the entrance hall before she saw him, her uncle's voice raised in indignation and entitlement, demanding to see his niece immediately, as though he had any right to her time or presence after what he had done. And Catherine felt her body go cold and then hot, as she rose from her desk with hands that wanted to tremble, but which she forced into steadiness, and she arrived in the entrance hall to find Uncle Edmund arguing with Pemberton the butler, while looking every bit as florid and dissipated as she remembered, perhaps more so, with broken capillaries across his nose and the unmistakable signs of a man whose vices were destroying him from within. "Uncle Edmund," Catherine said with a calmness she did not feel, and he turned to her with that false smile that had once made her feel obligated and guilty, but which now simply made her angry, and he began speaking rapidly about family obligations and his rights as her guardian, and how she owed him compensation for the years he had housed and fed her, and Catherine stood perfectly still and felt the old familiar fear trying to reassert itself, the learned helplessness of those terrible months in his household when she had been entirely at his mercy. But then she felt Sebastian's presence behind her. He had come from his study the moment Pemberton sent word, and his hand came to rest on the small of her back in silent support. And suddenly the fear dissolved, like morning fog beneath. "Son." Sebastian's voice when he spoke was colder than Catherine had ever heard it, containing all the aristocratic authority of generations of dukes, combined with the barely leashed fury of a man protecting what he loved, and he said, "You have no rights here, Hartwell, no claim on my wife or my home, and you will explain your presence immediately, or be removed by force." Cadent Uncle Edmund's bluster faltered slightly before he rallied and pulled papers from his coat and declared that Catherine's marriage settlement had been invalid without his approval as her guardian, that he was demanding financial compensation for breach of contract, and that if Sebastian did not pay, he would create a scandal that would damage both their reputations irreparably. Catherine watched Sebastian's expression transform into something that might have frightened her if it had been directed at her rather than at her uncle, and he said with deadly quiet, I wondered when you would make this attempt, which is why I took the liberty of having you investigated 6 months ago. And what I discovered was most illuminating evidence of systematic theft from your niece's inheritance, fraudulent gambling debts in her name, forgery of your late brother's signature on multiple documents, and enough criminal activity to see you transported, if not hanged. And Uncle Edmund's face went from florid to ashen, as Sebastian continued. So here is the choice you face. You will sign documents, relinquishing all claims to Lady Catherine and her inheritance. You will leave England permanently for the continent, with a small allowance sufficient to keep you in modest comfort, and you will never contact my wife again, or I will deliver this evidence to the magistrate, and you will face prosecution for fraud and theft, and spend what remains of your miserable life in prison or on a transport ship to Australia. Catherine stepped forward, then, and she felt the strength that these months at Ashbourne had built in her, the certainty of her own worth that Sebastian's love had restored, and she looked at the man who had stolen from her and diminished her and made her feel worthless and said clearly, "You told me I had no value beyond the money my parents left, that I was a burden you bore out of obligation, but you were wrong. I had value then, and I have value now, not because of any inheritance but because of who I am, and I will not allow you to make me feel small ever again. I will not give you that power." And she saw something flicker in her uncle's eyes that might have been shame before the habitual selfishness reasserted itself. The documents were signed within the hour under the stern supervision of Sebastian's solicitor, who had been summoned from the village, and Uncle Edmund departed Ashbourne in a hired carriage, looking diminished and defeated, and Catherine stood on the steps with Sebastian's arm around her waist and watched him disappear down the drive, and felt something fundamental shift in her chest, felt the last chains of her past breaking away, and when the carriage finally vanished from sight, she turned to Sebastian and said, "Thank you for protecting me, but thank you more for giving me the strength to protect myself." And he pulled her close and kissed her forehead and replied, "You always had that strength, my darling. You simply needed to remember it, and I am honored to stand beside you as you reclaim everything he tried to steal, not just money but your sense of your own worth."